The dust kicked up around her boots as Margaret Rose stumbled into Piach, Nevada. Her clothes torn and her dark hair matted with dried blood that wasn't entirely her own. It was August 1874, and the mining town sprawled before her like a mirage shimmering in the brutal desert heat. Its wooden buildings and saloons promising shelter from both the unforgiving sun and the memories that chased her across 3 territories. She'd been running for 6 weeks now, ever since the night her father's business partner had tried to claim her as payment for imaginary debts, and she'd defended herself with the only weapon within reach, a fireplace poker that had found its mark with fatal accuracy. The law wouldn't care that she'd acted in self-preservation. Women who killed men, even in defense of their virtue, rarely found justice in courtrooms dominated by male judges and all-male juries. Margaret pressed herself against the rough exterior of the general store, trying to catch her breath and orient herself to this new town that might become either her sanctuary or her grave. Her 22 years of sheltered life in St. Louis hadn't prepared her for the harsh realities of frontier survival. The money she'd taken from her father's safe before fleeing had run out 2 towns ago, and she'd resorted to sleeping in barns and stealing biscuits from unguarded windowsills just to stay alive. Now, watching the rough miners and cowboys moving through Piach's dusty streets, she wondered how long she could maintain even this precarious existence before someone recognized her from the wanted posters that were surely spreading across the West like wildfire. "You look like you could use some water, miss." The voice came from beside her, low and steady, with the kind of authority that made people listen without raising volume. Margaret's head snapped up, her green eyes wild with the trapped animal fear that had become her constant companion. The man standing there wasn't particularly tall, maybe 5'10", but he had the kind of solid, capable build that came from years of hard work rather than idle posturing. His face was weathered by sun and wind, probably in his late 20s, with serious brown eyes that assessed her with more concern than threat. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, worn denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, a leather vest, and a hat that had seen better days. A gun belt sat comfortably on his hips, but his hands were nowhere near the weapons. "I'm fine," Margaret lied, her voice coming out as a hoarse rasp that contradicted her words. She tried to straighten up, to look less like a half-dead fugitive and more like a respectable woman who had every right to be leaning against this building in the middle of a scorching afternoon. The man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been amusement. "That's so? Well, I reckon you're entitled to your opinion, even when it's wrong." He gestured toward a building down the street with a sign that declared it to be the Silver Strike restaurant. "My sister runs that place. She's always looking for help if you're looking for honest work. And she feeds her employees proper meals, not just scraps." Margaret's stomach cramped at the mention of food, betraying her despite her best efforts at maintaining dignity. "I don't need charity. Good, because I'm not offering any." He tilted his hat back slightly, studying her with those calm, measuring eyes. "I'm Isaac Irving. I run a ranch about 5 miles outside town, raise horses mostly, some cattle. My sister Judith came out here after her husband died, decided she'd rather cook for miners than remarry in a hurry. She's particular about who she hires, but she's got good instincts about people. If you're running from something, she won't ask questions you don't want to answer. But if you're running toward trouble, she'll spot that too, and you'll find yourself back on this street faster than you can blink." The directness of his assessment should have frightened Margaret, but instead, she felt something loosen in her chest, the first hint of hope she'd experienced in weeks. Here was someone who saw her desperation, but wasn't trying to exploit it. That alone made him different from most of the men she'd encountered since leaving Missouri. "Why would you help me? You don't know anything about me." Isaac considered this for a moment, his gaze drifting to something in the distance before returning to her face. "My mother used to say that every person deserves at least one chance to become who they're meant to be, instead of who circumstances made them. Maybe you've already had your chance and wasted it. I don't know your story. But the look in your eyes tells me you're fighting hard to stay alive and stay decent, and that's worth something in my book." He tipped his hat. "The offer stands. Judith's place is the one with the blue curtains. Tell her Isaac sent you. She'll feed you regardless, but what happens after that is between you and her." He turned and walked away before Margaret could formulate a response, his boots stirring up small clouds of dust with each step. She watched him go, this strange cowboy who offered help without demanding anything in return, and felt tears burning behind her eyes for the first time since she'd fled St. Louis. She'd forgotten that kindness existed in the world, had started to believe that everyone she met would either want to use her or turn her in for whatever reward money was being offered. But Isaac Irving had looked at her like she was a person rather than a problem or an opportunity, and that simple act of recognition made something crack in the walls she'd built around her battered heart. Margaret pushed herself away from the building and made her way toward the restaurant with the blue curtains, her legs shaking with exhaustion and malnutrition. The interior was dimmer than the bright street outside, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. The space was cleaner than she'd expected, with about a dozen tables covered in checked cloths, and a long counter where several miners sat hunched over plates of beef and potatoes. The smells of cooking food made her head swim with hunger and desperate longing. A woman emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 35, with the same brown eyes as Isaac but softer features and hair pulled back in a practical bun. "We're between lunch and dinner service, but I can fix you a plate if you're hungry." Her gaze took in Margaret's appearance with the same assessing quality her brother possessed, but there was compassion there too, the kind that came from personal experience with hardship. "Your brother sent me." Margaret forced the words past the lump in her throat. "He said you might have work available." Judith nodded slowly, moving behind the counter to pour a glass of water from a pitcher. She slid it across to Margaret. "Drink that first, then we'll talk." She disappeared into the back again, returning a moment later with a plate piled with roasted chicken, potatoes, and green beans. "Eat. Can't have a proper conversation with someone who looks like they might faint from hunger." Margaret wanted to maintain her pride, to refuse the charity she'd claimed not to need, but her body overruled her mind. She fell on the food with as much restraint as she could manage, trying not to wolf it down like a starving dog, even though that's exactly what she felt like. Judith watched without comment, refilling the water glass twice before Margaret finally slowed down enough to feel embarrassed by her display. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, staring down at her empty plate. "I can work to pay for this meal. I can wash dishes, clean floors, whatever you need." "Isaac said you might need work." Judith settled onto a stool across from her, folding her arms on the counter. "I do need help. The lunch rush has been getting bigger as more miners come through town, and I can't manage it all alone anymore. But I need to know you're not going to disappear in the middle of a shift or bring trouble through my door. I've built something here, and I protect what's mine." Margaret met her eyes, seeing the steel beneath the kindness. "I won't steal from you or lie to you. But I can't tell you everything about where I came from or why I'm here. If that's not acceptable, I understand, and I'm grateful for the meal regardless." Judith was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming a thoughtful rhythm on the counter. "We've all got pasts we'd rather not discuss." Lord knows I've got chapters in my story I wouldn't care to revisit. What matters to me is what you do going forward. I can offer you $40 a month plus room and board. There's a small room upstairs you can have. It's not fancy, just a bed and a washstand, but it's private and the door has a good lock. You'll work breakfast and lunch service 6 days a week, Sundays off. I expect punctuality, cleanliness, and respect for the customers even when they don't deserve it. In return, you'll get 3 meals a day, a safe place to sleep, and no questions about whatever you left behind. Do we have an understanding? The offer was so far beyond what Margaret had dared to hope for that she couldn't quite process it. A job, a room, safety, food, all the things she'd been scrambling to secure through increasingly desperate measures. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why take a chance on me? I could be anyone. You could be, Judith agreed. But my brother's judgment is usually sound, and I've learned to trust my own instincts over the years. You've got honest eyes, even if they're scared ones. And I remember what it's like to need a fresh start in a place where nobody knows your story. She stood up, untying her apron. Let me show you the room. You look like you could use a bath and about 12 hours of sleep before we discuss anything else. Margaret followed Judith up a narrow staircase to the second floor, where a short hallway held 3 doors. Judith opened the one at the end, revealing a small but clean space with a narrow bed, a washstand with a chipped basin and pitcher, a simple wooden chair, and a trunk for belongings. A window overlooked the street below, and someone had hung thin curtains that would provide privacy when drawn. To Margaret, who'd been sleeping in hay lofts and under bridges, it looked like paradise. There's a bathhouse 2 buildings down, Judith said, pressing a few coins into Margaret's hand. Tell Mrs. Chen I sent you and she'll fix you up proper. Take the rest of today to get settled. We'll start fresh tomorrow morning at 5. Breakfast service begins at 6, so you'll need to be downstairs and ready to work by then. After Judith left, Margaret sank down onto the bed and let herself cry for the first time since fleeing St. Louis. They weren't tears of despair anymore, but something more complicated: grief for everything she'd lost, relief at finding temporary refuge, and a strange, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build a life here that didn't involve constantly looking over her shoulder. She thought about Isaac Irving, the quiet cowboy who'd seen her desperation, and responded with practical kindness rather than exploitation or judgment. She wondered if she'd see him again, then told herself it didn't matter. She couldn't afford to let anyone get close enough to discover her secrets, not when discovery meant a rope around her neck. But that night, after she'd bathed away weeks of grime and slept in a real bed for the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret dreamed of brown eyes that looked at her like she was worth saving. The next morning arrived too early, announcing itself with the crowing of roosters and the sounds of Piotch waking up for another day of mining, gambling, and all the other activities that kept frontier towns alive. Margaret dressed in her cleanest clothes, which still looked shabby and worn, and made her way downstairs to find Judith already working, her hands moving efficiently as she mixed batter for pancakes and fried bacon in a large cast iron skillet. "There's an apron hanging by the door," Judith called without turning around. "Put it on and come help me with these biscuits. We've got about 20 miners who come through for breakfast before heading to the diggings, and they expect their food hot and ready when they arrive." Margaret had never worked in a restaurant, but she'd helped cook meals at home, and the basic principles translated well enough. She fell into the rhythm of the work, grateful for tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied with something other than fear and regret. The miners began arriving as the sky lightened from black to gray to pale blue, stomping in with heavy boots and calling out orders for coffee and eggs and steak. Some of them stared at Margaret with the frank curiosity men always showed toward a new woman in town, but none of them were disrespectful, perhaps because Judith's no-nonsense presence discouraged such behavior. The morning passed in a blur of cooking, serving, cleaning, and repeating the cycle. By the time the last miner left to start his shift at the silver mines that gave Piatch its lifeblood, Margaret's feet ached, and her arms felt like lead from carrying heavy plates and pots. But she'd earned her keep, and the satisfaction of that simple fact felt better than anything she'd experienced in months. "You're a good worker," Judith said, surveying the clean kitchen with approval. "Faster learner than my last girl, and you don't complain. We'll get along just fine." She handed Margaret a cup of coffee and a plate of the leftover biscuits and bacon. "Sit down and eat. We've got about 2 hours before lunch preparation starts, and you'll need the energy." They were sitting at one of the tables, eating in companionable silence when the door opened and Isaac Irving walked in. He'd cleaned up since yesterday, his face freshly shaved and his shirt looking like it had actually seen an iron recently. His eyes found Margaret immediately, and she saw something that might have been relief cross his features before his expression settled back into neutral calm. "Morning, Judith." "Morning, miss." He nodded at Margaret, then focused on his sister. "Thought I'd stop by and see how things were working out." "Checking up on me or on her?" Judith asked with the bluntness that seemed to run in the family. "Margaret's doing fine. She's got a good work ethic and she doesn't spook easy, which is more than I can say for some of the girls I've hired." So he'd been concerned enough to make a special trip into town. Margaret wasn't sure how to feel about that. Part of her wanted to believe his interest was genuine kindness, while another part, the part shaped by weeks of running and hiding, warned that everyone wanted something eventually. But Isaac just nodded, accepting his sister's assessment, and turned his attention to Margaret with those serious brown eyes. "I'm glad it worked out. Piatch's not the gentlest town, but there are good people here if you know where to look." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I come into town most Saturdays for supplies and to check on Judith. If you ever need anything help with something, or trouble you can't handle alone, you can find me here or leave word at the livery stable. Tommy, who runs it, knows how to reach me at the ranch." The offer was stated matter-of-factly, without any undertone of expectation or demand for gratitude. Margaret found herself studying him more carefully than she had the day before, taking in the details she'd missed in her exhausted desperation. He had good hands. She noticed strong and capable but not brutalized by violence, with calluses that spoke of hard work with horses and rope, rather than gunfights and brawling. His face had the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from spending days under the sun and wind, with small lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned, even if he wasn't smiling now. There was something fundamentally steady about him, like a boulder in a stream that water flowed around but couldn't move. "That's kind of you," Margaret said carefully, "but I'm sure I'll be fine. Judith's given me more help than I had any right to expect." Something flickered in Isaac's eyes, disappointment, maybe, or recognition that she was keeping him at arm's length deliberately. He nodded once. "The offer stands regardless. Judith, I'll be back Saturday as usual. You need anything from the ranch before then. I could use some more eggs if the chickens are producing, and maybe another side of beef if you've got one ready." Judith was watching the exchange between her brother and her new employee with poorly concealed interest. "Will you stay for lunch? I'm making pot roast. Can't today got a fence line that needs mending before the horses decide to go exploring." Isaac tipped his hat to both women and headed for the door, pausing just before he left. "Margaret Rose." He said her full name like he was testing the sound of it. Welcome to Piatch. I hope you find what you're looking for here." Then he was gone, leaving Margaret staring after him with her heart beating faster than it had any right to. Judith made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "My brother's not usually so interested in new arrivals. He must have seen something in you that impressed him." "I can't afford to be interesting to anyone," Margaret said quietly. "I need to stay quiet and unnoticed." Judith's expression sobered. "That's hard to do in a town this size where everyone knows everyone else's business. But I understand the impulse." She stood up, gathering the empty plates. "Isaac's a good man, one of the best I know, but he's also patient as stone and twice as stubborn. If he's decided to take an interest in your welfare, he'll keep showing up whether you encourage him or not. It's just his way. He can't stand to see something suffering without trying to fix it, whether it's a horse with a bad leg or a woman who looks like she's been through hell." Margaret wasn't sure whether to be comforted or alarmed by this assessment. She'd spent weeks avoiding any kind of personal connection, knowing that the more people learned about her, the more danger she'd face. But something about Isaac's quiet concern had slipped past her defenses, making her wonder what it might be like to trust someone again, to share the burden of her secrets with another person who might understand rather than condemn. She pushed the thought away and focused on washing dishes, letting the hot water and soap scrub away both grease and dangerous fantasies. She couldn't afford to fall for the first kind man who crossed her path, not when falling meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant exposure, and exposure meant death. Better to stay alone and safe than to risk everything for the illusion of connection. But over the following weeks, as summer deepened into early autumn and Piatch baked under an unforgiving sun, Isaac Irving proved impossible to ignore. He appeared every Saturday like clockwork, always with some practical reason for his visit, delivering supplies to Judith, picking up tools he'd ordered from the general store, checking on a horse he'd sold to one of the miners. And each time, he found a reason to speak to Margaret, to ask how she was settling in, to mention something about the town or the territory that he thought she might find useful. His attention was never pushy or inappropriate, never made her feel trapped or obligated. He simply showed up, steady and reliable as the sunrise, treating her with the same calm respect he showed everyone else while making it quietly clear that he saw her as a person worthy of care. And slowly, almost against her will, Margaret found herself looking forward to Saturdays, to the sound of his boots on the restaurant's wooden floor, and the way his face relaxed into something approaching a smile when he saw her. "You're going to have to acknowledge it eventually," Judith said one morning in late September, watching Margaret's face light up as Isaac's distinctive silhouette appeared in the doorway. "The way you feel about him, the way he feels about you." Margaret's hand stilled in the dishwater, soap bubbles clinging to her fingers. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Judith's voice was gentle but firm. "I've seen the way you watch each other when you think nobody's looking. Whatever you're running from, whatever you're afraid of, it's making you deny yourself the possibility of happiness. And that's a tragedy, because happiness is rare enough in this world without refusing it when it's offered freely." "I can't." Margaret's throat felt tight, the words scraping out like gravel. "I'm not who you think I am. I'm not someone who deserves happiness or second chances. If Isaac knew the truth about me, he wouldn't look at me the way he does now." Judith was quiet for a long moment, then dried her hands and came to stand beside Margaret at the sink. "6 years ago, my husband died in a mining accident back in Colorado. What I didn't tell anyone, including Isaac, is that I was grateful. John was a hard man, quick with his fists when he drank, and he drank most nights. I stayed because I'd made vows before God, but when that tunnel collapsed and trapped him underground, I felt like I'd been released from prison. She met Margaret's shocked gaze steadily. I'm not proud of feeling that way about my husband's death. It's not the kind of thing you admit in polite society. But it's the truth, and it shaped who I became afterward. I came to Piotr to start fresh, to build something that was mine alone, where nobody could hurt me or control me. So I understand running from the past better than you might think. Margaret felt tears burning her eyes. Did you kill someone? No, but I thought about it more than once. Judith's hand found Margaret's shoulder, squeezing gently. We all carry things we're not proud of. The question isn't whether you've made mistakes or done things you regret. The question is what you choose to do with the life you have now, in this moment. Isaac's offering you something real. Maybe it's time to decide if you're brave enough to accept it. That Saturday, when Isaac appeared for his usual visit, Margaret made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. After he'd finished his conversation with Judith about ranch business and was preparing to leave, she followed him outside into the cool autumn air. Isaac. His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that acknowledging his first name made real. Can we talk? Somewhere private. He turned, surprise and something else, hope, maybe flickering across his face. Of course. There's a spot just outside town overlooking the valley. We could walk there if you'd like. They left Piotr behind, following a path that wound up a small rise to a cluster of rocks that provided both shade and a sweeping view of the desert landscape below. The town looked smaller from this vantage point, almost insignificant against the vast expanse of Nevada territory stretching in every direction. Margaret perched on one of the sun-warmed boulders, trying to organize thoughts that felt scattered and desperate. Isaac settled nearby, not crowding her but close enough that she could feel his presence like warmth from a fire. He didn't push, didn't demand explanations, just waited with that infinite patience that seemed to define him. It should have irritated her, that calm acceptance, but instead it made her feel safe enough to speak. I don't know how to do this, Margaret said finally, staring out at the horizon rather than meeting his eyes. I don't know how to let someone care about me. I don't know how to trust that it's real or that it won't end in disaster. I don't know how to love if I'm being honest. I've never felt it in a way that didn't come with conditions or expectations or demands. My father loved me when I was obedient, instinct. Louis loved me when I was ornamental and silent. Love always seemed like another word for control, and I learned to fear it rather than want it. The confession hung in the air between them, more vulnerable than she'd intended to be. She waited for Isaac to laugh or dismiss her concerns or worse, to see her admission as an invitation to exploit her inexperience. Instead, he was quiet for several heartbeats, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than mocking. Then let me teach you gently, Isaac said, and the words were a promise rather than a command. Love isn't supposed to hurt or diminish you. It's not about control or possession or making someone small enough to fit your expectations. Real love, the kind worth having, makes space for another person to become fully themselves. It's patient and respectful and built on trust that accumulates slowly, through consistent action rather than pretty words. Margaret turned to look at him then, searching his face for signs of deception or hidden agendas. But his brown eyes were clear and steady, holding her gaze without wavering. You barely know me. How can you talk about love when you don't know who I really am or what I've done? I know you work hard and don't complain. I know you're kind to Judith even when you're exhausted. I know you're running from something that scares you badly enough to cross half the country alone. I know you're brave and stubborn and determined to survive against odds that would have broken someone weaker. He shifted slightly, angling toward her. As for what you've done, we've all done things we regret. The measure of a person isn't in their worst moment, but in how they choose to move forward afterward. And I've watched you choose to be decent and honest every day since you arrived in Piach, even when it would have been easier to be otherwise. I killed a man. The words burst out of her like poison she'd been holding behind her teeth for too long. Back in St. Louis, my father's business partner tried to force himself on me, said I belonged to him now, that my father had lost everything gambling and I was payment for his debts. I grabbed a fireplace poker and I hit him and he fell and there was so much blood. He wasn't moving when I ran. The law won't care that I was defending myself. They'll hang me if they find me. She waited for horror, for Isaac to recoil and withdraw his offer of gentle teaching. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. That's why you jumped half out of your skin when I first approached you. That's why you keep watching the street like you expect to see a marshal ride up any minute. Aren't you going to tell me to turn myself in? To face justice. Margaret's voice was bitter with accumulated fear and shame. Isn't that what a good man would do? A good man makes sure justice is actually just before encouraging someone to walk into its teeth. Isaac's jaw tightened, the first sign of anger she'd seen from him, but it wasn't directed at her. I've seen enough of frontier justice to know it favors money and power over truth. If you'd killed this man in a fair fight, maybe you'd have a chance in court. But a woman defending her virtue against a man with wealth and connections. They'd convict you before the trial started, just to prove that women can't take matters into their own hands, no matter the provocation. His understanding felt like absolution, like water after weeks in the desert. Margaret realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face without permission. I don't want to hang. I don't want to die for refusing to be raped. But I can't stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for someone to recognize me from a wanted poster. I can't live like this forever, Isaac. The fear is eating me alive from the inside. He moved then, closing the distance between them and pulling her into an embrace that felt like safety made solid. His arms were strong around her, not trapping but sheltering, creating a space where she could fall apart without fear of judgment. You won't hang, he said quietly with absolute conviction. I won't let that happen. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Margaret, not unless you choose to be. She clung to him, breathing in the smell of leather and sun-warmed cotton and something indefinably him. For the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she let herself believe that survival might be possible, that she could have a future beyond simply staying alive one more day. And beneath the relief and gratitude, she felt the first stirrings of something else, a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the Nevada sun, and everything to do with the man holding her like she was precious, rather than damaged. I don't know how to do this, she repeated, but this time the words meant something different. I don't know how to let you care about me without being afraid you'll wake up one day and regret it. I don't know how to believe this is real. Isaac pulled back just enough to look at her face, his thumbs brushing away tears with a gentleness that made her throat ache. Then we'll figure it out together one day at a time. I'm not going anywhere, Margaret. I'm not a man who offers his word lightly, and I'm giving it to you now. Whatever you need, time, space, patience, protection, it's yours. No conditions, no expectations beyond honesty between us. What if I can't ever be what you need? What if I'm too broken to love you properly? The question came out small and scared, revealing the deeper fear beneath all her others. Love isn't something you do properly or improperly, Isaac said, with the same steady calm he brought to everything else. It's not a test you can fail or a skill you have to master before you're allowed to try. It's just showing up for each other, day after day, choosing to care even when it's hard. And you've already proven you know how to do that. You show up for Judith every morning. You work hard even when you're exhausted. You treat people with respect even when they don't deserve it. You know how to love, Margaret. You just need to believe you're allowed to direct it toward yourself and toward someone who cares about you in return. His words settled into her chest like seeds taking root in thirsty soil. Margaret closed her eyes, letting herself lean into his strength, allowing the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe she could learn this different version of love he described, the kind that built up rather than tore down. Maybe she could trust him with the broken pieces of herself and discover they weren't as irreparable as she'd believed. "Teach me," she whispered, the words both a plea and a promise. "Teach me how to love without fear. Teach me how to believe this is real." "I will," Isaac promised, and sealed the vow with a kiss so gentle it felt like a prayer against her lips. The kiss lasted only a moment before Isaac pulled back, giving her space to breathe and process, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. It was that restraint, that careful attention to her comfort, that made Margaret want to close the distance between them again, to learn what it felt like to be kissed by someone who valued her consent as much as her affection. But they had time now, she realized. Time to take things slowly, to build trust through consistent action rather than rushing into passion that might burn hot but collapse quickly. Isaac wasn't going anywhere, and neither was she. For the first time since arriving in Piach, Margaret let herself think beyond tomorrow, beyond next week, to imagine a future where she might actually be happy. They walked back to town as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Isaac's hand found hers during the walk, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both new and inevitable. Margaret marveled at how such a simple connection could make her feel tethered to the earth again, less like she might blow away with the next strong wind. Judith was waiting when they returned to the restaurant, one look at their joined hands and Margaret's tear-stained but peaceful face telling her everything she needed to know. "About time," she said with satisfaction. "I was starting to think I'd have to lock you two in a room together before anyone made a move." "Judith," Isaac said with mild exasperation, but there was affection in his tone. "Do you have to meddle in everything? When my brother's happiness is at stake, absolutely." Judith turned to Margaret with a smile that held genuine warmth. "He'll treat you right or he'll answer to me, and trust me, I'm a lot scarier than I look." "I believe you," Margaret said, and found that she was smiling too, the expression feeling strange and wonderful on her face after weeks of fear and grimness. Isaac stayed for dinner that evening, helping clean up afterward despite Judith's protests that he'd done enough ranch work for one day. Margaret watched him work, noting the easy competence with which he approached even simple tasks, the way he joked with his sister and made her laugh. This was what family looked like when it functioned properly. She realized teasing and support in equal measure, affection demonstrated through action rather than just words. When he finally prepared to leave, riding back to his ranch before full dark made the journey treacherous, Isaac pulled Margaret aside for a moment of privacy. "Can I come calling on you proper? Take you for a ride next Sunday when you're off work? There's some beautiful country around here I'd like to show you." The old-fashioned courtship language made Margaret's heart squeeze with something that felt dangerously close to joy. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." "Good." His smile transformed his usually serious face, making him look younger and more carefree. "Wear something practical. We'll be on horseback for part of it, and bring a warm shawl. The desert gets cold once the sun drops." After he left, Margaret helped Judith close up the restaurant for the night, sweeping floors and wiping tables in companionable silence. Finally, as they climbed the stairs to their respective rooms, Judith paused. "You told him, didn't you, about why you're running?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "And he didn't turn away. It wasn't a question. No, he said he'd help me face whatever comes, that I wasn't alone anymore." Margaret's voice cracked on the last word. Judith reached out and squeezed her hand. "That's Isaac. Once he decides someone's his to protect, he doesn't give up easily. You could do worse than letting yourself love him back." That night, Margaret lay in her narrow bed and thought about love, the twisted, controlling version she'd always known, and this new possibility that Isaac offered. Could she really learn to trust it? Could she let down her guard enough to accept what he was offering? The risk felt enormous, but so did the potential reward. For the first time in her life, she might have the chance to experience what love was supposed to feel like: partnership rather than possession, support rather than control. She thought about his kiss, gentle and patient, asking rather than taking. She thought about his steady presence over the past weeks, showing up without fanfare, offering help without demanding gratitude. She thought about the way he'd listened to her confession without judgment, responding with practical concern for her safety rather than moral condemnation. Everything about him suggested that his promises were genuine, that she could trust him with her battered heart and he would handle it carefully. The decision settled over her like a blanket on a cold night. She would take the risk. She would let Isaac teach her what love could be when it was given freely rather than used as a weapon. She would try to believe in the possibility of happiness, even knowing that disaster could still find her at any moment. Sunday arrived with clear skies and temperatures mild enough to make riding comfortable. Margaret dressed in her most practical clothing, a split skirt that Judith had helped her alter for horseback riding, a simple blouse, and a sturdy jacket against the morning chill. Her hair she braided and pinned up, knowing loose hair would tangle impossibly in the wind. Isaac appeared at precisely 9 o'clock, riding his own horse and leading a gentle mare he said was named Daisy. "She's good with nervous riders," he explained, helping Margaret mount. "Patient and steady, like her owner." The self-deprecating humor made Margaret laugh, dissipating her nervousness about both the horse and the outing. They rode out of Piach heading north, following a trail that wound through sage-covered hills and occasional stands of juniper. Isaac kept their pace easy, narrating the landscape as they went, pointing out landmarks, explaining the history of various mines they passed, telling stories about the territory that brought the harsh country alive with personality. He was a better storyteller than Margaret had expected, his dry wit surfacing in unexpected moments that made her smile. After about an hour, they crested a rise and Margaret gasped at the view below. A hidden valley spread before them, green with grass despite the desert surroundings, fed by a spring that created a small stream winding through the center. A few cattle grazed peacefully, and in the distance, she could see the buildings of what must be Isaac's ranch, a modest house, a barn, several corrals. "This is home," Isaac said, with quiet pride in his voice. "My father homesteaded here 20 years ago before the mining boom. He had a good eye for land, found the one spot in 50 miles where water runs year-round. Died 5 years back, left the place to me. It's not fancy, but it's mine, built with honest work rather than luck or violence." They descended into the valley, and Margaret felt something loosen in her chest as they entered this hidden sanctuary. After months of harsh desert travel and the rough edges of Piach, this green oasis felt like stumbling into an impossible dream. The sound of running water, the soft movement of horses in the corrals, the sight of chickens scratching in the dirt near the house, it all spoke of permanence and care. of someone building a life with intention rather than just surviving day to day. Isaac dismounted and helped Margaret down, his hands steady on her waist. "Come on. I'll show you around, then we can have the lunch I packed. There's a good spot by the stream where the cottonwoods provide shade." The house was simple but well built, with solid walls and a roof that showed no signs of leaking. Inside, Margaret glimpsed furniture that had been made with care rather than purchased: a table, chairs, a bed frame, all showing the marks of careful craftsmanship. Everything was neat without being fussy, practical without being grim. It looked like the home of a man who took pride in his surroundings even when nobody else was watching. "I built most of it myself, with some help from neighbors when I needed an extra set of hands for the heavy work," Isaac explained, running his hand along the doorframe with unconscious affection. "It's not much, but it's solid, built to last like everything else I try to do." They walked the property together, Isaac explaining his plans for expanding the horse herd, showing her the vegetable garden he maintained, introducing her to his dogs, 2 border collies named Jack and Jill, who circled them with cautious interest before accepting Margaret's presence. The tour felt significant somehow, like Isaac was sharing not just his physical space but his dreams and ambitions, inviting her to see the future he was building and consider whether she might want to be part of it. Finally, they settled by the stream under the cottonwoods, spreading a blanket and unpacking the lunch Isaac had prepared: fresh bread, cheese, apples, and cold chicken that was probably Judith's contribution. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the water and the wind in the trees, letting the peace of the place seep into their bones. "I want to tell you something," Isaac said eventually, setting down his half-eaten apple. "About why I noticed you that first day, why I sent you to Judith." Margaret turned to look at him, curious and a little apprehensive about what confession might be coming. "I was married once," Isaac said quietly. "Her name was Sarah. We met when I was 22, married within 6 months, thought we'd have forever to build a life together. But she died in childbirth 2 years later along with the baby, a son." His voice remained steady, but Margaret could see the old pain flickering in his eyes. "After that, I threw myself into building this ranch, into work hard enough to let me sleep at night without dreaming. I told myself I didn't need anyone else, that loving someone just meant setting yourself up for loss." He picked up a stone and tossed it into the stream, watching the ripples spread. "I believed that for 5 years. And then I saw you stumbling into town looking half dead but still fighting, still standing despite everything trying to knock you down. And something in me recognized something in you: that stubbornness, that refusal to surrender even when surrender would be easier. I thought if you could keep fighting after whatever you'd been through, maybe I could stop hiding behind work and isolation. Maybe I could take the risk of caring about someone again." Margaret's chest ached with empathy and something deeper, something that made her want to gather his pain into her hands and soothe it away. "I'm sorry about your wife and son. That's a terrible loss to carry." It was. Still is, some days. Isaac met her eyes. "But I'm learning that loss doesn't have to mean the end of everything, that you can honor what you've lost while still choosing to live fully in the present. Sarah wouldn't have wanted me to spend my whole life grieving. She was practical that way, always focused on what could be done rather than what couldn't be changed. She sounds like she was a good person. She was, and I think she would have liked you." The words were offered simply, without drama, but Margaret understood the significance. He was making space for both his past love and his present feelings, showing her that caring about her didn't mean erasing what came before. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what I'm offering isn't casual or thoughtless. I've loved before and lost it, and I know exactly what I'm risking by opening my heart again. But you're worth the risk, Margaret. Getting to know you, learning to love you, that's worth whatever pain might come." Margaret reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "I'm still scared," she admitted. "Scared that my past will catch up with me and destroy any chance at happiness. Scared that I'll fail at being what you need. Scared that I don't know how to be in a real relationship with someone who actually sees me rather than just what they want me to be." "Fear is reasonable," Isaac said. "Life offers no guarantees, and you've got more reason than most to be cautious. But we can be scared together. We can face whatever comes together. That's what partnership means, not one person carrying all the burdens while the other stays safe, but both of us taking on life's challenges shoulder to shoulder." He shifted closer, and Margaret found herself leaning into his warmth, resting her head on his shoulder. It felt natural and right, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. "Teach me," she said again, echoing her earlier plea. "Teach me how to do this, how to trust, how to love without constantly waiting for disaster." "It starts like this," Isaac said softly, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Sitting together, sharing space and silence, learning what makes each other laugh and what causes pain, building trust through small actions repeated consistently, showing up when you say you will, telling the truth even when it's hard, choosing kindness even in moments of frustration." They stayed by the stream until the sun began its afternoon descent, talking about everything and nothing, childhoods and dreams and fears and hopes. Margaret told him about growing up in St. Louis, about a mother who died when she was young and a father who loved gambling more than his daughter. Isaac shared stories about building the ranch, about the hard lessons learned from brutal winters and drought summers, about the satisfaction of breeding horses that were both beautiful and functional. With each revelation, the walls Margaret had built around her heart crumbled a little more. Isaac didn't push, didn't demand more than she was ready to give, but his steady acceptance created a safe space where vulnerability felt possible rather than dangerous. By the time they rode back toward Piatch in the golden light of late afternoon, Margaret felt something shift inside her, a tentative unfurling of hope, the beginning of belief that maybe this could actually work. Over the following weeks, they fell into a pattern. Isaac came to town every Sunday, and they spent Margaret's day off exploring the country around Piatch, riding to hidden canyons and abandoned mining camps, picnicking by mountain streams and walking through sage-covered hills. He taught her to ride better, to read the desert landscape, to appreciate the harsh beauty of the territory. And slowly, gently, he taught her what love could feel like when it was given without conditions. He held her hand when they walked and kissed her when they parted, but never pushed for more than she was ready to give. He listened when she talked about her fears and shared his own vulnerabilities in return. He made her laugh with dry observations about town characters, and made her think with questions about what she wanted from life beyond simple survival. He showed up consistently, kept his promises, and demonstrated through daily action that his care for her was genuine and lasting. And Margaret found herself falling in love tentatively at first, then with increasing certainty. It felt nothing like she'd expected, nothing like the dramatic passion described in novels or the desperate neediness she'd seen in other women. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding a place where she could finally rest and breathe and be herself without pretense or performance. She loved the way Isaac's face lit up when he saw her, the way his hands were always gentle despite their strength, the way he treated her like an equal partner rather than a pretty object to be possessed. She loved his steady reliability, his quiet humor, his unwavering integrity. She loved that he'd seen her at her worst desperate and dirty, and running from the law and chosen to care about her anyway. Not despite her flaws, but as a complete person who happened to have both strengths and struggles. By the time October arrived, painting the cottonwoods gold and bringing cooler temperatures to the desert, Margaret had accepted the truth she'd been dancing around for weeks. She was deeply, irrevocably in love with Isaac Irving, and the realization both terrified and exhilarated her. She was working in the restaurant one Thursday afternoon, serving lunch to the usual crowd of miners when a stranger walked in. He was dressed better than most men in Piotch, with a suit that spoke of money and a face that radiated authority. Something about him made Margaret's blood run cold, some instinct screaming danger even before he opened his mouth. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice carrying the nasal tones of the Midwest. "I'm looking for someone. A young woman, early 20s, dark hair, green eyes. She'd be traveling alone, probably using a false name. She's wanted for murder back in Missouri." Margaret forced her hands to stay steady as she poured coffee for another customer, even though her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description," she said, keeping her voice level. "But we get a lot of travelers through here. You might try asking at the hotel." The man's eyes swept the room, and Margaret felt them linger on her face a moment too long. "I'm Detective Howard Miller, hired by the deceased's family to track down his killer. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her capture." He pulled out a folded paper and laid it on the counter, a wanted poster with a crude sketch that looked enough like Margaret to make her stomach drop. "Her name is Margaret Rose. Ring any bells?" "No, sir." Margaret met his eyes directly, knowing that looking away would be as good as a confession. "But I'll keep my eyes open. Where can you be reached if I hear anything?" "I'm staying at the Grand Hotel, room 12. Miller took back the poster and tucked it away. "I'll be in town for a few days, asking questions. The reward is $500, enough to set someone up pretty comfortable. Think about it." After he left, Margaret had to excuse herself to the back room where she stood shaking, pressing her hands against the wall to keep from collapsing. Miller had looked right at her and somehow hadn't recognized her, but it was only a matter of time before someone made the connection. The wanted poster wasn't a perfect likeness, but it was close enough that anyone who studied it carefully would realize she matched the description. Judith found her there a few minutes later, taking one look at Margaret's face and immediately understanding something was wrong. "What happened?" "There's a detective looking for me. He's staying at the Grand Hotel." The words tumbled out between gasping breaths. "I have to leave, tonight, before he figures it out." "You're not going anywhere," Judith said firmly. "Running will just make you look guilty and leave you vulnerable on the road. We need to think this through carefully." She grabbed Margaret's shoulders, forcing her to focus. "Does Isaac know about the detective?" "No, he's at the ranch. He won't be back until Sunday. 4 days away, an eternity when danger was breathing down her neck. Then we get word to him now. Tommy at the livery stable can ride out and bring him back." Judith was already moving, thinking several steps ahead. "In the meantime, you stay out of sight. No more working the lunch crowd where anyone can see you. I'll tell customers you're sick, that you're quarantined upstairs with something contagious. That'll keep people away and give us time to figure out a plan." Margaret wanted to argue, to insist she should run rather than endanger the people who'd helped her. But fear had locked her joints, made her incapable of decisive action. She let Judith guide her upstairs to her room, let the older woman tuck her into bed like a child and promise that everything would be all right even though they both knew it might not be. Isaac arrived 3 hours later, his horse lathered from hard riding. He took the stairs 2 at a time and burst into Margaret's room looking more worried than she'd ever seen him. "Judith told me. A detective from Missouri. Margaret nodded miserably. He's going to figure it out. Someone will recognize me from the poster, or he'll hear about the new girl working at Judith's, or I'll make some stupid mistake that gives me away. And then everything ends for me, and for anyone who helped me hide. Isaac sat on the edge of her bed, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. Listen to me carefully. You're not going to hang. You're not going to prison. We're going to handle this, but we need to be smart about it. His jaw was set with determination, his brown eyes fierce with protective anger. I know a federal judge in Carson City, Judge Thompson. He's a fair man, not corrupt like some of the local officials. If we can get you in front of him with the full story, including the fact that you were defending yourself against sexual assault, he might grant you clemency, or at least ensure you get a fair trial with proper representation. That's a long shot, Margaret said hollowly. And even if it works, it means publicly admitting what happened, testifying about the attack. Everyone will know. They'll call me a murderer or worse. They might. Some people are small-minded and cruel. Isaac's grip on her hands tightened. But you'd be alive and free, able to hold your head up knowing you faced your accusers honestly. And anyone worth knowing would see the truth that you defended yourself against a predator, which took more courage than most people ever have to summon. Margaret wanted to believe him, but fear had its claws too deep in her chest. What if the judge sides with the law? What if my testimony isn't enough? I'll hang Isaac. They'll hang me, and you'll have wasted your time caring about a dead woman. Then we'll appeal to the territorial governor. And if that fails, we'll take it to the Supreme Court if we have to. His voice was steel wrapped in velvet, implacable in its certainty. You're not alone in this fight anymore, Margaret. You've got me, and you've got Judith, and you've got every decent person in Piotch who's gotten to know you these past months. We'll stand with you, testify to your character, show that you're not some cold-blooded killer but a woman who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. For the first time since the detective had walked into the restaurant, Margaret felt a flicker of something other than pure terror. Hope was too strong a word, but maybe possibility existed where before she'd seen only disaster. You'd really do that? Risk your reputation and your ranch for someone you've only known a few months? I'd do it for anyone being railroaded by an unjust system, Isaac said. But you're not just anyone. You're the woman I love, Margaret, and I protect what I love no matter the cost. The declaration hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying in its simplicity. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I love you too. God help me. I love you so much it scares me worse than the law does. Because if I lose you, if caring about me destroys your life, Isaac cut her off with a kiss that was deeper and more passionate than any they'd shared before, full of promise and claim and reassurance all tangled together. When he pulled back, both of them were breathing hard. You're not going to lose me. Not to the law, not to fear, not to anything. We're in this together now, for whatever comes. They spent the rest of the evening planning, joined by Judith, who brought food and coffee and her own sharp strategic mind. By midnight, they'd hammered out an approach. Isaac would ride to Carson City first thing in the morning, present the situation to Judge Thompson, and request emergency intervention. Meanwhile, Margaret would stay hidden in the restaurant, and Judith would spread word that her helper had contracted typhoid and needed quarantine. It was a thin story, but it might buy them a few days before Detective Miller got too curious. What if he searches the building? Margaret asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. What if someone tells him where I am? Then you go out the back window and run to the livery stable, Isaac said, pointing out the route. Tommy knows the situation. He'll have a fast horse saddled and ready. You ride straight to the ranch. Here's a map showing the way. The dogs know you now. They won't bark. Hide in the root cellar behind the house until I get back. It's not perfect, but it's something. It was more than something, it was a lifeline, a plan that accounted for her safety even in worst-case scenarios. Margaret memorized the map and the instructions, trying to calm her racing heart. She'd been running on instinct and desperation for so long that having an actual strategy felt foreign and wonderful. Isaac left before dawn, after one more fierce kiss that tasted like promises and fear in equal measure. Judith stayed close throughout the day, maintaining the fiction of quarantine while actually keeping watch on the street below. Detective Miller appeared twice, asking questions at various businesses, but he didn't approach the restaurant. By nightfall, Margaret allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd pulled off the deception. But hope proved premature. On the second day of Isaac's absence, while Margaret was eating a nervous breakfast in her room, she heard the heavy tread of boots on the stairs, followed by Detective Miller's voice demanding to see the sick girl. Judith's protests grew louder, and then Margaret heard the unmistakable sound of the detective pushing past her, doors opening and closing as he searched the rooms. Margaret didn't hesitate. She threw open her window and climbed out onto the roof of the building's back porch, then dropped to the ground with a jarring impact that sent pain shooting through her ankles. She ran, limping slightly, toward the livery stable where Tommy saw her coming and had a horse ready as promised. She mounted clumsily, fear making her movements jerky, and kicked the mare into a gallop even as she heard shouting behind her. The ride to Isaac's ranch took an hour of hard pushing, following the map's landmarks with single-minded focus. By the time she arrived, the horse was exhausted and Margaret was shaking with reaction. She found the root cellar exactly where Isaac had described, a low door set into the hillside behind the house, cool and dark and smelling of earth and stored vegetables. She led the horse into the barn first, unsaddling it and giving it water before hiding herself in the cellar as instructed. The space was cramped and uncomfortable, with barely enough room to sit upright, but it was safe. Margaret huddled in the darkness, listening to her own ragged breathing and trying not to imagine all the ways this could end badly. Hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. She heard horses at one point and froze in terror, but the riders didn't approach the house, and eventually the sound faded. Night fell, turning the cellar completely black. Margaret dozed fitfully, jolting awake at every small sound. Her back ached from the cramped position and her stomach gnawed with hunger, but she didn't dare leave her hiding place. Isaac had said to stay until he returned, and she'd trust his judgment even if it meant discomfort. Dawn was breaking when she finally heard the sound she'd been waiting for, Isaac's voice calling her name, gentle but urgent. She pushed open the cellar door and stumbled out into the gray pre-dawn light, her legs cramping after so many hours in one position. Isaac was there immediately, catching her as she swayed, his arms wrapping around her with desperate relief. "Thank God," he breathed into her hair. "When Judith sent word that Miller had discovered you were gone, I rode straight through the night to get back. Are you hurt? Just stiff and scared?" Margaret pulled back enough to see his face, registering the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes and mouth. "Did you see Judge Thompson? What did he say?" Isaac's expression was carefully neutral, which scared her more than bad news would have. "Come inside. We need to talk, and you need food and water." They went into the house, where Isaac built up the fire and heated water for coffee while Margaret sank onto a chair, her body trembling with delayed reaction. When he finally sat across from her, his face was serious but not defeated. "Judge Thompson agreed to hear your case. He'll travel to Piotch next week for an emergency session. But Margaret, he can't guarantee the outcome. He'll listen fairly, but the law is clear about killing, even in self-defense. The best we can hope for is that he'll commute a death sentence to prison time, maybe 5 to 10 years. The numbers hit her like physical blows. 5 to 10 years behind bars, assuming the judge was merciful. And if he wasn't, the noose. Margaret felt dizzy, her vision narrowing to a tunnel. I can't do that. I can't go to prison for defending myself against rape. It's not justice. I know. Isaac's voice was rough with emotion, which is why we have another option, one I didn't want to tell you about unless it was necessary. He reached across the table, taking her hands. There's a community in Oregon Territory, near the coast. It's made up of people who have been failed by the law in one way or another, freed slaves, former prisoners who served unjust sentences, women escaping bad situations. They look out for each other, protect their own from authorities who come asking questions. A man I know from the war years is part of it. He owes me a significant debt. If we can get you there, they'll hide you and give you a new identity. You'd be safe, Margaret. Really safe, not just hiding but actually protected by a whole community. It sounded like a fairy tale, too good to be true. Why didn't you mention this before? Because it means running for the rest of your life, never being able to return to Nevada or any place you might be recognized. Living under a false name, always looking over your shoulder, and it means deciding whether you want me to come with you or stay here to maintain the ranch. Isaac's jaw tightened. I'll go if you ask me to. I'll give up everything I've built and start over with you in Oregon. But I need you to understand what that choice costs before you make it. Margaret stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. He'd give up his home, his land, his entire life for her. The generosity of it was staggering. I can't ask you to do that. This ranch is everything you've worked for. You're everything I've worked for, Isaac interrupted fiercely. The ranch is wood and land and animals. It matters, but not more than you do. If staying here means losing you to prison or worse, then it's worth nothing to me. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as the full weight of his love crashed over her. This was what she'd been looking for without knowing it, someone who valued her more than property or reputation, who would sacrifice comfort and security just to keep her safe. I don't deserve you. That's not how love works. It's not about deserving, it's about choosing. He moved around the table to kneel beside her chair, looking up into her face. So choose, Margaret. Face the judge and take your chances with the law, or run to Oregon and build a new life where nobody can touch you. Either way, I'm with you. You're not alone in this decision. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to think past the emotion clogging her throat and making her head swim. The judge route was the honest one, the path that might clear her name and let her live openly. But it was also incredibly risky, potentially ending with her death or imprisonment. The Oregon option was safer but meant permanent exile, permanent hiding. Neither choice was perfect, but one allowed for the possibility of a real future while the other was just trading one form of imprisonment for another. Oregon, she said finally, opening her eyes to meet Isaac's steady gaze. I choose Oregon. I choose life and freedom and the chance to build something real with you, even if it means doing it under a false name in a strange place. I'm tired of letting the law punish me for surviving. Relief and determination warred in Isaac's expression. Then we leave tonight. I'll sell the ranch to my neighbor. He's been wanting to expand for years. It won't be full value, but it'll give us cash to start over. We'll take the back trails through the mountains to avoid the main roads, travel at night when possible. It'll be hard, Margaret. Weeks of rough camping and constant vigilance. But at the end, we'll have a real life waiting. They spent the day preparing. Isaac liquidating what assets he could quickly while Margaret packed supplies and sorted through what they could carry versus what had to be left behind. Judith arrived mid-afternoon, her face drawn with worry. When Isaac explained their plan, she didn't argue or try to talk them out of it. Instead, she hugged them both fiercely and pressed a bag of coins into Margaret's hands. "My savings," she said when Margaret tried to refuse. "I want you to have it. Use it to build your new life." She turned to her brother. "Take care of each other. Write when you can, even if it's just to let me know you're alive and well. I'll miss you terribly, but I'd rather have you gone and happy than here and destroyed." The goodbye was wrenching, made worse by the knowledge that they might never see Judith again. But as the sun set and they loaded their horses with supplies, Margaret felt something unexpected rising in her chest, not just fear or sadness, but also anticipation. They were choosing their future rather than letting it be dictated by past mistakes and unjust laws. That was its own kind of freedom, its own form of justice. They rode out as darkness fell, following trails that Isaac knew from years of exploring the territory. For 3 weeks they traveled, staying off main roads, camping in hidden valleys, trading horses periodically to avoid anyone tracking particular animals. It was hard, exhausting work, and there were moments when Margaret wondered if they'd ever reach safety or if they'd spend the rest of their lives running. But through it all, Isaac was beside her, steady, capable, and utterly committed to their shared future. At night, huddled together for warmth around small campfires, he taught her to read the stars for navigation and told stories about the country they were passing through. During long days in the saddle, they talked about what they wanted their new life to look like: a small farm maybe, or a business in town, something simple and honest that would let them live quietly. And slowly, Margaret realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The constant terror that had dogged her since St. Louis had transformed into something else: determination, mixed with cautious hope. Whatever awaited them in Oregon, they'd face it together. That partnership, that absolute certainty of having someone at her back, was worth more than any comfort or security they'd left behind. They crossed into Oregon territory in early November, the landscape shifting from desert to forest as they climbed into the mountains. The air was cooler here, damper, with the smell of pine and moss replacing sage and dust. Isaac's contact met them at a predetermined location, a weathered man named Samuel, who looked them over with shrewd but kind eyes. "Isaac vouches for you, which is good enough for me," Samuel said, shaking Margaret's hand. "The community's about 2 days north from here. We've got a small house available if you're interested, nothing fancy, but it's solid and private. You'll need new names, of course. We'll register you as married to simplify things." Margaret glanced at Isaac, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his face. They'd talked about marriage during their journey but hadn't made anything official, both too focused on survival to think about ceremony. "We're not actually married yet," she admitted. Samuel shrugged. "Easily solved if you're willing. I'm ordained. I can perform the ceremony right here if you'd like, or we can wait and do it properly once you're settled. Your choice." Isaac turned to Margaret, taking her hands in his. "I know this isn't how you probably imagined getting married, standing in a forest with no witnesses except a stranger, wearing dirty clothes, running from the law. But if you're willing, I'd like to make this official. To promise before God and anyone who'll listen that I'm yours and you're mine, for however long we have." Margaret felt fresh tears, happy ones this time, tracking down her cheeks. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you, Isaac Irving, in a forest in rags with the law chasing us. None of that matters compared to the fact that you're the best person I've ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving I was worth the risk you took on me." So they married there, under the towering pines with Samuel officiating and the horses as witnesses. Isaac produced 2 simple gold bands from his saddlebag. He'd bought them before leaving Nevada. He admitted, hoping she'd say yes. They exchanged vows that were traditional in structure but deeply personal in meaning, promising to love and honor and protect each other through whatever challenges life threw their way. When Samuel pronounced them married and Isaac kissed her, Margaret felt something lock into place in her chest, a sense of rightness and completion she'd never experienced before. This was what love was supposed to feel like. Not the desperate neediness or controlling possession she'd witnessed in others, but this steady, rock-solid partnership where 2 people chose each other freely and built a life together through conscious, daily effort. The community Samuel brought them to was everything he'd promised: a collection of families living in relative isolation, supporting each other through shared labor and mutual protection. They'd created their own small society outside the bounds of traditional law, with their own rules and systems of justice that prioritized compassion and practical morality over rigid adherence to statutes that often protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Margaret and Isaac became part of this community, registered under the names Martha and Isaiah Robinson. The house was small but well built, with enough land for a garden and a few animals. Isaac found work training horses for other settlers, while Margaret helped several of the women with sewing and cooking. They made friends cautiously, learning who could be trusted with pieces of their real story and who was better kept at arm's length. The first winter was hard, the Oregon coast cold and wet in ways Nevada had never been. But they had each other, and they had safety, and slowly they began to believe they might actually have a future. Spring brought wildflowers and hope in equal measure. Margaret discovered she was pregnant in April, the realization hitting her with joy and terror intertwined. "We're going to have a baby," she told Isaac one evening, watching his face carefully for signs of regret or fear. Instead, she saw pure, unfiltered happiness transform his expression. "A baby." He repeated the words like they were miraculous, which maybe they were. "Our baby." He pulled her close, one hand settling on her still flat stomach with reverent gentleness. "Are you happy about this?" "I know we didn't plan it, and circumstances aren't ideal." "I'm happy," Margaret interrupted, meaning it absolutely. "Terrified but happy. This baby will have what I never did: 2 parents who chose each other, who built a life based on love rather than obligation or convenience." That feels like the best possible start. Their son was born in December 1875, during a storm that battered the coast with wind and rain. The local midwife attended the birth, coaching Margaret through hours of labor while Isaac paced outside, too nervous to sit still. When the baby finally arrived healthy and screaming his displeasure at the cold world, Isaac held him like he was made of spun glass, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome to the family. We're going to take such good care of you." They named him Thomas, after Isaac's father, and he became the center of their world. Watching Isaac with their son, Margaret saw new depths to the man she'd married: patience and tenderness and playfulness that emerged in response to fatherhood. He sang to Thomas when the baby fussed, taught him to smile with silly faces, carried him everywhere in a sling he'd fashioned from soft leather. Life settled into comfortable rhythms: work and family, community gatherings and quiet evenings at home. Margaret learned to bake bread properly, to preserve vegetables for winter, to mend clothes until they literally fell apart from use. Isaac expanded his horse training operation, developing a reputation for quality that brought customers from miles around. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, They were safe and happy. Years passed with surprising speed. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's steady temperament and his mother's quick mind. A daughter, Emily, arrived when Thomas was 3, followed 2 years later by another son, James. The house that had seemed adequate for 2 people bulged at the seams with a family of 5, full of noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of children. Margaret sometimes thought about her old life in St. Louis, about the woman she'd been before fear and violence transformed her. That person felt like a stranger now, someone from a story she'd heard rather than lived. She'd become someone new in Oregon, stronger, more confident, absolutely certain of her worth and her right to exist freely in the world. Isaac's gentle teaching about love had taken root and grown into something magnificent, not just between them, but expanding outward to encompass their children and their community and their shared life. "You ever regret it?" Isaac asked one evening after the children were asleep and they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the ocean. "Giving up your real name, living in exile, never being able to go back." Margaret considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind. "Sometimes I regret the circumstances that forced the choice. I wish I'd never had to kill anyone or run for my life. But the life we've built here, this family, this community, this love, I wouldn't trade it for anything. The past made me who I am, but it doesn't define me anymore." "You taught me that." Isaac pulled her closer, dropping a kiss on her temple. "You taught yourself. I just provided a safe space for you to figure it out. You provided more than space, you provided love when I didn't know how to accept it. You saw me at my worst and somehow convinced me I was worth saving." Margaret turned to look at him, seeing silver threads beginning to appear in his dark hair, lines deepening around his eyes from years of sun and laughter. He was aging, as was she, and somehow that felt like a victory. They were growing old together, building a history through accumulated days and shared experiences. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as the first time she'd spoken them. "I'll never stop being grateful that you walked up to that desperate woman in Piotch and offered her hope instead of judgment." "I love you too," Isaac replied. "And I'll never stop being grateful you were brave enough to accept what I offered, to take the risk of learning to love when everything in your experience suggested it wasn't safe." He smiled, the expression warm and content. "We make a good team, Martha Robinson." The false name still sounded strange sometimes, but Margaret had grown into it over the years. Martha Robinson was who she was now: wife, mother, member of a community, woman who'd survived impossible circumstances and built a beautiful life from the rubble. Margaret Rose, the frightened fugitive, was someone she used to be but no longer needed to carry forward. Their children grew up hearing carefully edited stories about their parents' past, how they'd met in Nevada, fallen in love, and chosen to start fresh in Oregon. The darker details would come later, when the kids were old enough to understand nuance and complexity. For now, they knew their parents loved each other deeply, worked hard, and valued honesty and kindness above material success. Those lessons, more than any specific facts about the past, would shape the people Thomas and Emily and James became. By the time Thomas turned 18 in 1893, the small community had grown into a proper town, with a general store and a church and even a small school. Isaac had become a respected figure, known for his integrity and his skill with horses. Margaret had established herself as the person people came to for advice about difficult situations, her own experiences having given her wisdom about navigating moral gray areas with compassion and practical sense. They attended Thomas's 18th birthday celebration, surrounded by friends and neighbors who'd become family over the years. Watching her eldest son, now taller than his father, with the same steady brown eyes, Margaret felt overwhelming gratitude for the life she'd been given. It hadn't come easily, and the path had been fraught with danger and difficult choices. But standing here, surrounded by love and community and the tangible proof of a life well lived, she knew she'd made the right decisions. That night, after the celebration ended and the younger children were asleep, Margaret and Isaac walked down to the beach, something they did periodically when they needed to remember why they'd chosen this place. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, dark water meeting darker sky, the sound of waves a constant rhythm that had become the soundtrack of their life together. 18 years since we ran, Isaac said quietly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a different lifetime entirely. Both are true, Margaret replied, leaning into his warmth. Time is strange that way it passes, but it also accumulates until you're carrying decades of memories that shape who you are. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I never thanked you properly for what you did for me, for believing me when I told you my story, for protecting me, for teaching me what love could be. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved. Isaac turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. You saved mine too. I was half alive before you stumbled into Piotch, going through motions, building a ranch but not really building a life. You reminded me what it felt like to hope, to dream, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. We saved each other, Margaret. That's what love does when it's real. They kissed there on the beach, salt air and starlight and decades of shared history wrapped up in the connection. It wasn't the desperate passion of new love or the gentle exploration of first learning. It was the deep, abiding affection of two people who'd chosen each other again and again, through countless small decisions and several large ones, building a partnership that had weathered everything life threw at it and emerged stronger. Walking back to the house, their hands intertwined the same way they'd been on that first walk back to Judith's restaurant so many years ago, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd run from justice that wasn't just, from a system that would have killed her for refusing to be victimized. She'd found safety in the arms of a cowboy who saw her humanity when she'd almost forgotten she possessed any. And together, they'd built something beautiful from the broken pieces: a family, a home, a love that transcended the circumstances of its beginning. No regrets, she said softly as they climbed the porch steps. Not a single one. No regrets, Isaac agreed, opening the door to their home, their life, their future. The years continued to unfold with the particular grace that comes from a life lived with intention and care. Emily grew into a spirited young woman with her mother's determination and her father's practical wisdom, eventually marrying a young farmer from the next valley and settling close enough to visit regularly. James proved to have his father's gift with horses, taking over more and more of the training business as Isaac's joints began to protest long days in the saddle. Thomas stayed in the community, opening a small carpenter's shop where he crafted furniture with the same attention to quality that his father had always demonstrated. Grandchildren arrived, filling the house with noise and joy and the particular chaos that comes from toddlers discovering the world. Margaret, now in her 50s with silver threading through her dark hair, found herself teaching another generation, showing her granddaughter how to knead bread, explaining to her grandson why honesty mattered even when lying was easier. She passed on the lessons she'd learned, both from her own mistakes and from Isaac's gentle instruction about what love and family could be when built on solid foundations. Isaac, his hair now fully gray and his face deeply lined from decades under the sun, remained steady as ever, the rock Margaret leaned on when life felt overwhelming. the person she turned to first with both triumphs and troubles. They'd grown old together in the truest sense, their lives so intertwined that it was impossible to imagine one without the other. Sometimes, sitting on their porch in the evening watching the sun set over the Pacific, Margaret would tell Isaac about the girl she used to be, the frightened fugitive who stumbled into Piotch with nothing but fear and determination. She barely recognized that person now, so much had changed. But she honored her too, that desperate younger self who'd had the courage to keep fighting when surrender would have been easier. "She got us here," Margaret would say, meaning the frightened girl and the decisions she'd made. "Everything good in my life came from her refusal to give up." And Isaac would squeeze her hand and remind her that everything good in his life came from having the courage to approach that desperate woman and offer help instead of turning away. Their story, he maintained, was one of mutual rescue, two damaged people finding each other at exactly the right moment, then choosing to build something beautiful from their combined brokenness. As they moved into their 60s and then 70s, their pace of life slowed, but their connection remained as strong as ever. Isaac's back troubled him more, making long rides impossible, but he could still gentle a nervous horse with a few words and a steady hand. Margaret's eyesight faded, making fine needlework difficult, but she could still tell a story that would hold children spellbound for hours. They adapted to aging with the same teamwork they'd brought to every other challenge, supporting each other through the indignities and limitations of growing old. On their 40th wedding anniversary, though the date they celebrated was actually from their impromptu ceremony in the Oregon forest rather than any official record, their children organized a large gathering. Friends and family filled the house and spilled into the yard, 3 generations represented in the crowd. Toasts were made, stories told, laughter shared. Margaret stood beside Isaac, his arm around her waist as it had been for 4 decades, and felt completely, absolutely content. 40 years, Isaac said softly, his words meant only for her despite the crowd around them. Somehow both longer and shorter than I expected. Every day and no time at all, Margaret agreed. She turned to look up at him, seeing the young cowboy he'd been layered beneath the older man he'd become. If I could go back and tell that scared girl in Piotch how this would turn out, she'd never believe me. This happiness, this family, this love, it's so far beyond what I thought possible. Would you tell her anything differently, make any different choices? Isaac's question was curious rather than challenging. Margaret considered seriously. No, every choice, even the hardest ones, led here. I'd do it all again, the running, the fear, the risk of trusting you because this life was worth every difficult moment it took to reach it. As the celebration continued around them, Margaret reflected on the full arc of her story. She'd killed a man to protect herself, run from unjust laws, hidden under a false name, and built a life in exile. Society would call some of those choices criminal, evidence of moral failing. But standing here surrounded by people she loved and who loved her in return, Margaret knew differently. She'd done what was necessary to survive, then had the wisdom to accept help when it was offered. She'd learned to love without fear, to trust without constant suspicion, to believe in the possibility of happiness even when past experience suggested otherwise. That was the real lesson Isaac had taught her, she realized. Not just how to love one specific person, but how to open herself to life again after trauma had convinced her that safety required emotional isolation. He'd shown her that vulnerability could be strength, that trust could be earned through consistent action, that love could heal rather than harm. And she'd shown him that taking risks on damaged people could lead to the greatest rewards, that his capacity for patience and kindness was valuable beyond measure. They'd saved each other, just as he'd said. Two broken people who'd had the courage to reach for connection, despite every reason to protect their wounded hearts. And in reaching, they'd created something that transcended their individual pain, a family, a legacy, a love story that would be told by their descendants long after they were gone. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Thomas approached his parents with an unusual request. "I want to write down your story," he said. "The real story about how you met and why you came to Oregon. Not for publication or anything like that, just for the family. So future generations understand what it took to build the life we have." Margaret and Isaac exchanged glances, conducting a silent conversation in the way that only people who'd known each other for decades could manage. Finally, Margaret nodded. "All right. But you need to understand that some of it isn't easy to hear. Your mother was a fugitive from the law. We built our life here on a foundation of assumed names and deliberate deception." "I figured as much," Thomas said calmly. "You've dropped enough hints over the years. But that doesn't change who you are now, or how you raised us, or the values you taught us. If anything, knowing you overcame such difficult circumstances makes what you built even more impressive." Over the following months, Margaret and Isaac told their son the complete story, leaving nothing out. The attempted rape, the killing, the flight across territories, the detective hunting her, the decision to choose exile over uncertain justice. Thomas listened and wrote it all down, asking clarifying questions but never judging, never suggesting they should have chosen differently. When they finished, he set down his pen and looked at his parents with new understanding. "Thank you for trusting me with this, and thank you for having the courage to choose each other, even when it meant giving up everything else. If you hadn't, none of us would exist." "We chose life," Margaret said simply. "Everything else followed from that first choice to keep living, to keep trying, to believe that happiness was possible even when circumstances suggested otherwise." Isaac took her hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. "And we chose love, even when we didn't fully understand what that meant. That was the real leap of faith, believing that this connection between us was worth the risk of vulnerability and trust." Thomas carefully stored the pages of their story away, promising to keep it safe for future generations. After he left, Margaret and Isaac sat together in their quiet house, the silence comfortable rather than empty. They told their story, passed on the lessons learned, ensured that their descendants would understand the full complexity of the path that had led to this family. "I'm tired," Isaac admitted, a rare confession from a man who'd spent his life powering through physical discomfort. "Not just tonight, but in general. This body has carried me for 78 years and it's ready for rest." Margaret felt her heart clench with the knowledge that time was running out, that the decades they'd shared were approaching an ending. But she didn't panic or deny the reality. They'd had a good life, a great life, and whatever came next, they'd face it the same way they'd faced everything else, together for as long as possible. "Then rest," she said gently. "You've earned it. You've built a life that will outlast you by generations. You've loved well and raised good children and kept your word even when it cost you. That's enough, Isaac. That's more than enough." He squeezed her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "Promise me you'll be okay. When I'm gone, promise me you'll keep living, keep finding joy. I can't stand the thought of you just existing without really living." "I promise," Margaret said, though the words hurt to speak. "But you're not gone yet, old man. You're stuck with me for a while longer." Isaac smiled, the expression carrying echoes of the younger man who'd first offered to teach her about love. "Wouldn't have it any other way." They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, the same stars they'd navigated by during their flight to Oregon so many years ago. The universe had remained constant while their lives transformed completely from desperate fugitives to respected elders, from strangers afraid to trust to partners who knew each other's thoughts without speaking. It was a remarkable journey, made more so by how ordinary their daily life had become. They'd found the extraordinary in the simple accumulation of shared days, in the quiet triumphs of raising children and building community and choosing love again and again. Isaac passed away in his sleep 6 months later, on a spring morning when flowers were blooming and birds were singing. Margaret woke to find him gone, his face peaceful in a way it rarely was during waking hours. The grief was enormous but not bitter. He'd lived well and long, and he'd died in the home they'd built together, surrounded by evidence of a life fully lived. At his funeral, the entire community turned out, along with children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. Person after person spoke about Isaac's integrity, his kindness, his willingness to help anyone who needed it. They told stories that made people laugh and cry, painting a portrait of a man who'd lived by his values even when it would have been easier to compromise. Margaret listened to it all with a full heart, grateful that so many people had recognized the extraordinary nature of the man she'd loved. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it simple. Isaac taught me what love could be when it was given freely. He showed me that strength could be gentle, that power didn't require force, that real courage was choosing vulnerability despite the risk. I'm grateful for every day I had with him, and I'll carry his lessons forward for whatever time I have left. She lived another 5 years after Isaac's death, surrounded by family and supported by a community that had become her own. She spent her time with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories and values and the hard-won wisdom of a life fully examined. She never remarried, never sought another partnership. What she'd had with Isaac was complete and perfect in its own way, and she didn't want to dilute those memories by trying to recreate something that was fundamentally unrepeatable. On her 83rd birthday, surrounded by 4 generations of family, Margaret felt deeply content. She'd survived circumstances that should have destroyed her. She'd learned to love despite every reason to guard her heart. She'd built a beautiful life from the ruins of her past. And now, near the end, she could look back and see the full arc of her journey from frightened girl to confident woman, from desperate fugitive to beloved matriarch. "Tell us the story again, great-grandma," one of the youngest children begged, "about how you and great-grandpa met." Margaret smiled, gathering the child onto her lap. "It was a long time ago in a desert town far from here. I was lost and scared, running from things I'd rather not remember. And your great-grandfather, he was the kindest man I'd ever met. He looked at me and saw someone worth saving. He offered me hope when I didn't know I needed it, and then he taught me, very gently, how to love without being afraid." She told the sanitized version of the story, appropriate for young ears, but the heart of it remained true. A cowboy and a frightened woman, choosing each other against all odds, building something lasting from the most unlikely beginning. It was a good story, made better by the fact that every word of it was true. Margaret passed away in her sleep one night in late autumn, the same season when she'd arrived in Oregon so many years before. She went peacefully, her last thoughts of Isaac and the life they'd shared. Her children and grandchildren mourned her deeply, but also celebrated the remarkable woman she'd been, strong and resilient, flawed and human, capable of tremendous love despite experiencing tremendous pain. They buried her beside Isaac on a hillside overlooking the ocean, beneath a sky that stretched endlessly blue. The headstones, carefully carved by Thomas, bore the names they'd used for decades: Martha and Isaiah Robinson. But the family knew the truth inscribed in Thomas's hidden manuscript, the real story of Margaret Rose and Isaac Irving, two people who defied unjust laws and chosen love over fear, survival over surrender. Their legacy lived on through their descendants, people who understood that morality wasn't always black and white, that justice and law weren't always the same thing, that love required courage and vulnerability in equal measure. The story of how two damaged people found each other and built something beautiful became a foundational family myth, passed down through generations with increasing layers of meaning and interpretation. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Margaret and Isaac were together again, the fugitive and the cowboy, the student and the teacher, the two halves of a partnership that had transformed both their lives. They'd kept their promises to each other, lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world better than they'd found it. In the end, that was the truest measure of a life well lived. Their story, "I don't know how to love," she confessed, and the cowboy said, "Then let me teach you gently," became more than just words. It became a testament to the power of compassion, the possibility of redemption, and the transformative nature of love freely given and gratefully received. It was a reminder that everyone deserves a second chance, that justice should serve humanity rather than simply enforcing law, and that the bravest thing any person can do is open their heart to another, despite past pain and present fear. In the small Oregon community that Margaret and Isaac had helped build, their memory remained alive through the values they'd instilled and the example they'd set. Future generations would face their own challenges, make their own impossible choices, struggle with their own fears and doubts. But they'd have the story of their ancestors to guide them, a story that proved love could conquer fear, that partnership could transform lives, and that two broken people could create something whole and beautiful if they had the courage to reach for each other across their individual pain. That was the real gift Margaret and Isaac left behind. Not wealth or property or fame, but proof that love, when taught gently and learned courageously, could heal even the deepest wounds and create meaning from the most desperate circumstances. Their story would echo through the generations, a lighthouse guiding others through their own dark nights, a promise that happiness was possible even for those who'd lost their way. And so their tale ended not with death, but with continuation, their love living on through the family they'd created and the community they'd nurtured. In the final accounting, Margaret Rose and Isaac Irving had done exactly what they'd set out to do. They'd built a life together, learned to love without fear, and proved that even the most unlikely beginnings could lead to the most beautiful endings.